At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Grand Chief Edward John, who has bravely stepped up to the plate because he is going to not only do opening comments, but he's also going to provide the keynote address this morning, as Wendy John was unable to attend to join us this morning. Grand Chief Edward John is a hereditary chief from the Tla'amin Nation in northern British Columbia. As an Indigenous leader, he has dedicated his work in pursuit of social and economic justice for Canada's Indigenous peoples. And in my background, most of my work has been in First Nations education, and Grand Chief Ed John has been instrumental in helping us move forward the First Nations success in both public schools and First Nations schools in BC. Chief John has been a lawyer for more than 35 years. He holds a BA from the University of Victoria, a law degree from the University of British Columbia, and an honorary Doctor of Laws degree from the University of Northern British Columbia. Pardon? Oh, he's telling me to stop. Okay, that's enough of an introduction. Okay, well, with that, I'd like to introduce Grand Chief Ed John.
Good morning. I didn't really want you to be bored, so I asked her to cut it short. I'd like to thank our elder here for the prayer and the welcome this morning. The importance of recognizing the peoples on whose ancestral lands we're meeting. City of Richmond here, occupying the territory, but underneath is still Musqueam lands, Musqueam traditional unceded territory. And I think it's important always to recognize and acknowledge that. And the story from the elder and his brother as the descendants of Keaplano, the original explorer out here who was Captain Vancouver and the Spanish before that. And, you know, we sent Simon Fraser down from the north to down here, and they chased him back up to the north. So that's our collective history. We share a history in that regard. I wanted to say, we've been on this road for a while, and we've had ups and downs. And as Howard was explaining, we have our traditional system of authority and governance, and we've managed to create a government structures different in different parts here. It's very much different than, say, in the north where I come from, or with Haida Gwaii or other Tla'amin territory over where our moderator is or comes from, and that we have different traditions, but there are similar elements to it about running our governments, if you want to put quotation marks around that word, but running and taking care of our lands, taking care of our communities in a traditional sense, and that we had very unique structures around those systems of authority, but also management, the day-to-day management of our territories and our communities. And there are a lot of variations. In a modern context, beginning in the 1960s, Canada embarked on transferring funding to bands, grants to bands they were called then. Hired an administrator and you hired a secretary. That was it. Your office generally was in your secretary's bedroom in the village, you know, maybe a few boxes or maybe a suitcase or something of that nature. That was the beginning, and all we were doing was our administering government programs, as we do today. The programs that we have in our communities, they're not our programs. We administer government programs, a delegation of administrative responsibilities by way of a contribution agreement, setting out criteria for standards, expectations, guidelines that you're all so familiar with. And an accountability for the funding that we receive in accordance to the guidelines that are laid down in the programs under which funds under the contribution agreements that we have. That's where things are now, but there's a change of foot, some change of foot right now, and we'll cover that in a bit. But Stuart Phillips said that when we were doing a presentation to Cabinet and chiefs in British Columbia last September, he said he'd rather listen to Wendy Grant John than to listen to me. So I'm going to read some of the summary of Wendy's comments. I'm going to make it as boring as possible, so you think that my presentation is going to be excellent. But she couldn't make it here this morning. Musqueam's in the midst of some very large initiatives with the Government of Canada in the area of fisheries, in the area of lands, territories, in their traditional territory here. And oceans, waters, ocean resources, sea resources, and that they're in the midst of some major, probably groundbreaking initiatives with government. And there are meetings today with ministers and senior officials. They have a deadline to the end of March to try to complete some arrangements. So that's, as a member of the council, as Howard is a member of that council, working on these matters. Wendy talks about First Nations public service that we began a number of years ago when she was Associate Regional Director General at Indian Affairs downtown, and Bill Guerin, who you will hear from, I think, today or tomorrow, is now the Associate Regional Director General. He's also a Musqueam member. Worked in the department for many, many, many years in various capacities. They are, she says, that in self-government negotiations with Canada, but the question is always in the back of her mind, what does it mean? And I'm sure it is also in the back of your mind. What are the implications? We're all used to band council government structures, the role of the general membership, the role of the elected chief and council, and the role of administration in all of our communities. And here we're not necessarily talking about the governance side, on the council side or the general membership side, but here we're talking about the administration part, the public service. I mean, everybody calls, I'm mixing her speech and mine together, refers to the band office or that band office staff. What we really need to understand, as we've been saying, is that those of you who work in our communities are our public service. And so we refer to as a First Nations public service, those of you who do the day-to-day work in our communities in delivering programs and services. In the past, as she mentions, as Howard and myself, that we were involved in the delivery of services, talking about the historical governance through extended family systems that Howard was referring to earlier. And for using an example of fisheries, communities heavily reliant here on the sea resources, that the most experienced and most knowledgeable of the fishermen in the family would get together with the most knowledgeable of the other families, members of the other families who do the same kind of work, and work together to advise and talk about the politics and the policies of the sea resources in historical times, but also even now. She mentions the devolution and administration of government programs and services without the necessary planning or preparation or training. When I just graduated from high school, my late cousin, Harry Pierre, was our elected chief, and Valerie, in a way, niece, Harry's daughter, is here today. He was a chief then, and he said, you have the most education on the reserve. We want you to take over our welfare program. What do I know? I just graduated from high school. And so I figured I look at the white man, their town, I see they had an office. We didn't have an office. Our office was in late Harry's parents' home in underneath the bed of his sister, who was the band secretary. That was our office underneath that bed, about 4 or 5 boxes of papers. And so I saw the town, they had an office, and I figured, well, you know what? We need an office too, but we didn't have any building, so I found one. It was next door to the church, and it was a priest house. I took all his junks together and put them in the back of the church, and I said, he belongs over there in that church. This is our office now. Kind of upset the elders in the community because they thought it was disrespectful of the priest, who was a bit of a drunk too then, and involved with some unusual escapades with one woman in our village. And they said I should respect him. I said, well, I just ignored it. I didn't do anything about that. But that's where we ended up having our first office, and dealing with, in the summertime, between going to university in the fall, decided that I had to do something to try to set up that office, which I did. And as my nephew over here, Norman Alexis, who is now a certified general public or certified public professional public administrator, awarded that certificate last winter. After many years, he says, I'm going to be the band manager one day. But he's also in the financial administration of our office in Glasgow Nation. I was the financial officer, I was a social worker, I was a social welfare administrator, I was really the only employee aside from the band secretary. So I went around to all the homes, and this was in August, kids are going back to school, and I saw the government guidelines, and I talked to the people, and the needs and the guidelines were quite different. So I went with the people's needs and spent money on children, clothing, school supplies, all of that. Anyways, by October they were broke because I'd spent the money in August to help the families in the community. And that was, I'd be fired now, I think, if I ever did something like that. But Norman, my nephew Norman, would be in charge of all of the financial stuff. But that's where I think many of our communities, if you go back to your own communities, there's a beginning in the administration of these programs and services in all of our communities. And we didn't have any resources. I don't even know if they paid me for the work that I did for that 2 months during the summer. But it was always, the idea was to as close as we are, the closest we are to the community and the members and understanding their needs, the better we are to deliver the kind of services that are required. That was my thinking then, and it's still my thinking now, is that we are best positioned in our communities to understand the needs and the well-being of our communities and to be able to deliver services. So that's what, in the word, Krista was talking earlier, the word capacity. It's a big word, it has many dimensions to it, but what does it mean? Our ability to deliver the services that are required in our communities in accordance with our own policies or in accordance with the standards and guidelines set out in the contribution agreement. Wendy's points talk about no preparation, no planning, no training, and the devolution of programs. Talks about the current context, Canada's commitments, and where this national government is in relation to our peoples. And I'll go back to that in a bit. She talks about the challenges for the First Nations Public Service, this body that's convening this session, to listen, advice to listen, to develop solutions around tables like this for guiding our collective work into the future, to kind of training and the capacity development that's so required, the accreditation of these services, the accreditation of these trainings that are required. Like my nephew talked to me this morning about certified public administrator, public service administrator, the certificate that he has, and the credibility behind that paper, behind that certificate, for him to do the kind of work that is so essential and to do it within certain professional standards that he's gained through the training that he's undertaken, the necessity of training, the kind of training that is required, how much it makes sense to your community. I mean, there's a lot of training, but a lot of it is irrelevant, not really necessary, and according to somebody else's standards. What makes sense in our communities that is high level, professional, credible, and does an effective job for the people? And to engage with communities, which is a part of what's going on here. This, the First Nations Public Service was a going concern a number of years ago, and former Regional Director General Eric Magnuson killed that program, took the funding out of it, and then he went to Ottawa. Now he's gone from Ottawa because he was ineffective. He managed the regional office to the expectations of those people in headquarters, but he had favorites in British Columbia, and he catered to that. And that really is not a right way of managing the regional office for the Government of Canada, but he's gone, long gone now. The challenge, last challenge she puts forward is to look at as if we have a blank page in front of us and what it is that we would be able to do to ensure the effectiveness of services and programs in your communities, how you would structure it. I mean, all of you would be in the administration in some capacity in your community, or in the case of one of my relatives here as a member of council, to understand the relationship between administration and governance. That one has a political authority and the other has the ongoing day-to-day work that needs to be done. What is it that we require? The Government of Canada and the Government of British Columbia, and we've called on both levels of government to work with us to support our First Nations and the development of our capacity as they develop their capacity. They have the wherewithal and the resources to be able to pick students out of university and colleges who graduate and bring them into government and train them to do the administrative work. There's a lot of work behind government, when government make decisions or when government's planning and going through the process of decision making. There's a lot of expertise that is required. We don't have that expertise in a lot of cases in our communities. We have a certain degree of expertise when we have to go outside to pick up a lot of this on a contract basis for perhaps to develop some of the work that is necessary, planning perhaps, or development of proposals, or meeting with governments. There's a working relationship with people with expertise in the province, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, who work with us side by side on an ongoing basis. We position ourselves now, and those are the essential messages that Wendy wanted me to deliver in her presentation. I wanted to put a context of where we are with the national government and the provincial government. Both governments have made extensive commitments to our people, beginning with adopting and implementing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That I know a lot about because I was in Geneva when the negotiations were taking place over many, many years. Nobody ever thought we would get it done. Nobody ever had any expectations it would happen, it would spin in cycles forever, but we did manage to have the UN Declaration adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. The Human Rights Council consists of 48 member states. Canada was then a member of the Human Rights Council. We pushed and promoted and came to a conclusion and agreement on what is now in the UN Declaration, the 46 articles in the Declaration and the 23 preambular paragraphs. Right up front, if the Declaration is a right to self-determination, Article 3 and Article 4, the right to self-government. It's by no accident that it's up there. But these are international standards now that are being considered by the government of British Columbia and Canada. How do we engage with Indigenous peoples? They're asking themselves within these new standards. In the past, the government of Canada set up the Indian Act, set up band councils, set up membership, not membership codes, but who's a member of the band, criteria to become a status Indian under the Indian Act. They set all that up. In the Chilcotin decision, the Supreme Court of Canada said the Indian Act was set up by the government to suit its own purposes, to suit the government's purposes. It wasn't set up to suit and meet the purposes of our peoples. So the government now, in particular through the Attorney General and the Justice Minister, Jody Wilson-Raybould, who worked with us many years here in British Columbia as a regional chief and as a member of her own council up island, Quagule, Wewikai, I think. She's advocated and she's done a remarkable job in this country supporting and advising and educating the Prime Minister about the historical wrongs that have been done and the need for substantive changes into the future. And so she's put out the challenge to all of us, how will you organize as your own nations? Not band councils or bands, but as your own nations in accordance with your traditions. How will you organize? How will you set up? How will you engage governments? What will be the relationship between governments and the new nations that are established, or band councils? I mean, up to the nations, band First Nations to determine that into the future. What is it that we're going to need? We're at this really important threshold now, and that's why I think it's really important that you are here as you look into the future of your own nations and what you're planning and what your nation's thinking. How we have an effective public administration to do an effective job. Years ago in the 1990s, I will give you an example. The Reform Party of Canada, Preston Manning and all of those morons in that party, always were saying corrupt band councils, corrupt bands, corrupt administrations. And they kept on hammering away, so we said, well, you know what? We're going to answer that allegation, and we're going to do one thing. We're going to set up training and accreditation for financial officers in our communities, bookkeepers, accountants, management accountants, to ensure that there are credible records kept of our finances of our nations, and that we're able to provide these to auditors to ensure that we have clean audits, that these allegations of abuse and corruption by government, by the Reform Party then in opposition, are baseless, they're ill-founded, they're wrong, and they're racist. So we set up the BC Aboriginal Financial Officers Association in the 1990s. We got a bit of money from the regional director then, John Watson, to begin the process of training and accreditation to be able to manage our finances. This then became a national organization of financial officers, the Canadian, what do they call it, Canadian Aboriginal and Norman, those Financial Officers Association. It's a national body. Now, this national body is the one that's training and developing programs and training packages, training administrators. And I'm thinking, we never set them up to train administrators. We set up to train financial officers of our nations to make sure our records are well kept. But there was an absence. There was an absence there in which they came in. There was a void that they filled, and they continue to provide degrees of accreditation. How will this work with that organization, the BC Aboriginal Financial Officers Association, the National Financial Officers Association, is that we need to have a very focused and determined effort in capacity development of our nations. That's why the public service, First Nations public service, grew out of trying to meet that need in our communities. Administrators, financial officers, records, those who manage the nation's records, the band secretaries, for example, how the records are kept, because, for example, those records are essential in case the nation decides to go to court. What records do you have? How credible are those records? And so we are in this place where the Government of Canada, this last budget in February by the national government, 25% of the budget is earmarked for Indigenous peoples in this country. 25%. There will be a new fiscal relationship. What will that look like? It won't be anything like a band contribution agreement. There are nations that in the first year or so, there will be 100 First Nations across the country who will negotiate and 10-year agreements. Now the agreements that we have are from year to year to year. What will these new fiscal relationship documents look like? What will the nature of the fiscal relationship be with our peoples? We all know that in order for services to be provided, in order for there to be an administration, we need financial resources. In what manner do we engage with government to ensure that the resources that our communities need are sufficient, timely, and sustainable over time? And this national government has really made some, I think, tremendous efforts, made commitments, and have delivered in budgets, for example, to put their money where their mouth is. So we will have resources in our communities, or access to resources, to be able to plan and to think ahead. Many of our communities have community plans, for example. We pushed and promoted that in the 1990s as well. So we managed to get a small amount of money for every community, I think in the neighborhood of $75,000 to develop community management plans. Community plans, how lands, identification of the lands, the economic future of our nations, the social well-being of our community members. That $75,000 helped create plans which are now the foundation of community decision-making. The nation's able to make decisions because people have come together and created these plans and are working on them. We have many communities who have plans developed by consultants, and they sit on shelves. What's most important, of course, is where plans are developed in conjunction with the community. At the end of, and you may be bringing in professionals or expertise to help you with that, but at the end of the day, they become your nation's plans, because the people were involved in the plan, and people can say, this is we agree to, and we're going to support it and stand by it and make sure that our administration and our council currently are accountable within the standards and the framework that's set out in the plan. We are now promoting and looking for resources, and we have government commitments to have territory-wide plans, not just for on reserve and in the community, but throughout our respective territories. We have nation plans, how we will use the resources, what is a priority, where is a no-go area. These are kind of plans that are being developed now. It's important because in the Haida case, the Supreme Court of Canada said, if the government's even thinking about developing, you better sit down and talk to the First Nations. Well, in our case, then, we better sit down amongst ourselves and determine what our territory is, what it looks like, and what the priorities are within various parts of our territories. And this is, collectively, we're engaged in this process right now. All of this is rooted in the rights that we have inherited from our ancestors, what the Constitution calls Aboriginal rights, Aboriginal title, treaty rights, inherent rights. That is the foundation of our authority. We've never diminished that authority in any way whatsoever. Notwithstanding, we have band councils under the Indian Act system, under the government ways. We still have our inherent rights that we inherited from our ancestors. And our lands continue to be within the authority of our peoples and our nations. Over there where the airport is, there's an island. Larry was talking about Sea Island across the river here. It's a sizable island, and that's where the Vancouver International Airport is located. That is a subject of a huge discussion with the government right now, because of the title that the people have, the Musqueam people, that the original title that they've inherited from their ancestors. It's still there. And this government in Ottawa says, we will recognize that title. We will recognize the rights that exist, that they've inherited. And we will come to some kind of arrangement with the Musqueam First Nation. They're doing that with First Nations across this province. The federal government, and to a lesser degree, the provincial government, when we're negotiating access to territories, negotiating forestry agreements with the government, based on the rights that we have. That government over there in Victoria has also recognized the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the inherent rights that we have. What we have been fighting for a long time, the recognition of our rights, we have it in front of us now, with both governments supporting it. There's some actions that they're both taking that are inconsistent with their commitments, but we have to hold their feet to the fire. That we are now where we have been wanting to be for a long time. When I was a young guy, I was on railway blockades. I was occupying Indian Affairs offices, trying to shut them down, and we did eventually. We shut down the Indian Affairs office in Prince George, out in Terrace, over in the island. We said, we want these offices shut down. We want you to transfer those programs to our communities because we can do better. And they did. They shut all the offices down, and they transferred many of the programs to our communities, but they kept a lot of the funding and sent it back to Ottawa, the money that they saved, that they say. So, you know, we've been up and down over the years, but we're at this place, I think, now that we are incredibly blessed to be in this position. And it's been a long time coming. It's been a very long time in coming. We're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. We need to keep the government's feet to the fire. We need to continue to pressure. We need to advance the interests of our peoples and our communities. And I want to close with one thing. In the late 1980s, British Columbia, mid-1980s, set up a Royal Commission on Education. The late Barry Sullivan was the commission, and there were 4 recommendations on education. So the chiefs came together and we said we need to, and we saw that all of our 203 bands were just in isolation. They were little islands of 203 First Nations not working together, not collaborating. And so we said we have to do a better job working together, because our graduation rates for high school, the Dogwood certificate, is at 25% compared to the 75% or so for the public. And we said it's not acceptable. So we set aside, we got some money again from Indian Affairs, and we hired Krista to undertake the work. Bring the First Nations together and bring the experts, our educators, our teachers, our administrators, our homeschool coordinators, work out a plan as to how we can have higher levels of education successes with a Dogwood certificate, but at the same time, higher levels of success in our own traditions and languages and culture. So we have a graduation rate, I believe, close to 65% across the province since then. I think it's remarkable. Education has been the number one political priority for our First Nations in the province since that date, since that time. And we convinced the National Assembly of First Nations to make it its number one priority as well. And it is a number one national priority. We're making some headway, but we're losing ground in our languages. We're losing ground in the culture, but now I think it's picking up. But the language part is so fundamentally important. If we don't have that, who are we? And so how do we ensure, like Larry's been doing remarkable work at Musqueam to revitalize the language, the Ankaminam's language here in the Lower Mainland. Remarkable progress that they've made, small steps. And so as we move into the future, for example, Glasden Nation, we ran into the situation where we had a number of our students in the public school who were in suicide watch. And no amount of professional help was helping them at all. We figured our elders, we gathered elders, our culture leaders, hereditary leaders, beginning last summer, and said, we have to do something about this. And we saw that we had about 65 to 70 people who were fluent in our language in our 3 communities. And we figured we can build on that foundation to create fluency, the ability to speak the language. We have all kinds of written stuff, dictionaries, books, all of that, but there's no fluency in those books. You can't pronounce the words. You look at it and say, how do you pronounce this word? So it's about the fluency in speaking the language, building on language as a first foundation and rebuilding Glasden Nation. Second foundation is on culture, our ways, our teachings. Third foundation is our peoples, the way we're structured in traditional ways. And the fourth foundation is our lands, territories, and resources. But the key to all of it is the language fluency, and that's where we are in the midst of developing that. We're well along on that road to reestablish ourselves in accordance to our tradition. This was a challenge that Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Justice Minister, put out to all of us, and we decided to act on it in our own way in accordance with our tradition, and that's where we are. And once we approve it, I think that we will have a solid rebuilding foundation to work from. And this is where we put all of our children within our framework, that our Head Start, our kindergarten, preschool become centers of fluency, language learning. We're not there yet, but we're getting to that place. Our administrators are at band office. How do we teach them our language? Where do we start? What do we do for all of those to become fluent? And I'll give you an example. My friend, the chief of Six Nations, Ava Hill, in Ontario, you know that asset program that's used for employment training? They're using that money to train their workers to learn Mohawk. Why? Because they say if they're going to work with our people, they better know the language so they can speak to the people. So if you're going to go to work in Quebec, you better learn French, right? That's the same idea, no different. So I think we have really exciting challenges in front of us. We have a lot of work to do. And as we think and frame our way into the future, we have to build on the strengths that we have as Indigenous peoples. Our language, our songs, our teachings, our traditions, our history, and as original peoples on this land, some strengths that we have, notwithstanding we have a lot of adversity that we've encountered over the generations, we still have the resilience that we can build on, and that's what we need to count on. Our own ability, based on the strengths that we have. I have, somebody mentioned the word healing the other day to me, and I'm thinking, geez, it sounds so medical. For me, it's really the strengths that we need to rebuild that we have. We have strengths, we need to build on them, and we need to strengthen the strengths that we have, if you can understand what I'm saying with that. So, Krista, thank you for inviting me here. The work that's been undertaken by your organization, by this body, the First Nations Public Service, aligns with the other councils that we've established, the chiefs in British Columbia have established. We have a First Nations Fisheries Council. We have a First Nations Energy and Mining Council. We have a First Nations Health Council. We have a First Nations Technology Council. You name it, every major area that's important to our communities, we've tried to cover by having a collective strategy in British Columbia as First Nations. Not as many as 203 isolated islands of First Nations, but where all of us are working and collaborating and working with each other and learning from each other and building in the best way possible, rebuilding our nations. And it's a bit of a daunting task, I think, if you look at it that way, but I think it's a bit of an exciting future that we have in front of us. I am very optimistic, more optimistic in my whole life than when I was a teenager. I was optimistic. Now I'm experienced optimistic, or optimistic by experience, put it that way. So Krista, and to all of you, these next 2 days, dig down deep, find that strength that we have as our nations, and see how that can help you and help all of us to be able to be the strongest possible peoples that we can be, building on the resilience that we've had as Indigenous peoples, recognizing that we have had a lot of incredible challenges in the past of government policy, cultural genocide. We should never let us drag it. That should never drag us down. It didn't in the past, and we shouldn't do that, or we shouldn't allow that to happen now. So thank you very much. Merci.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kokshem. What an exciting opportunity. We are at the beginning of great things, and thank you so much for the encouraging words from Grand Chief Ed John. And I'm going to now read the rest of his biography here, because he's now left the stage and can't. The one I really wanted to highlight was when he mentioned he was involved in the development of the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He was also former chair of and the North American representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from January 2011 to December 2016. I think that is such an incredible job that you've done. And as you heard, champion of education, and Grand Chief Ed John, along with Judy Wilson from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and Regional Chief TG, were instrumental in supporting the negotiations with the First Nations Education Steering Committee and the First Nations Schools Association in securing an additional $20 million for BC Region for First Nations education. And of that $20 million, $14 million is going to be going out to First Nations schools in BC to support language and culture programming in our schools. So this is the first time that we've had dedicated money, and just wanted to recognize the part that Grand Chief Ed John played in that.